back again. My name is CJ Gross. I am the founder and CEO of Ascension Worldwide, an organization focused and dedicated on creating an inclusive world, right? That's the narrative of it. So I am so excited to be joined today by Tracie Taylor, who is the founder of Forge to Thrive, a OD, organizational development consultant, coach, professional, all these different things. But I have to ask you a question, Tracie. Number one, thank you for being a guest today as we talk about what it's like and experiences and what HR and business leaders need to know about being or their neurodiverse employees and how to support them. But where did you come up with this name of your organization?
Actually, I did a deep dive when I knew that my coaching practice, the coaching aspect of my practice would focus on clients with neurodivergence. I was finding even before I officially named my company that I was attracting neurodivergent candidates without them knowing that I was neurodivergent. It just seemed to be what was happening. And I was like, I really want to have my focus on neurodivergence. And with neurodivergence, you are forged to thrive because you go through some hard lessons just because of your neurodiversity, basically, because of the way you view life and the way corporate America is set up right now. You end up learning a lot of things about other people and yourself. So you are forged, and those who make it are usually thriving.
Awesome. I love it. And I'm drawn to it as well. And for those who have, read my book, What's Your Zip Code Story? Understanding and Overcoming Class Bias in the Workplace, you get to take a peek into my personal life being neurodivergent and not really, finding out until later in life. And you and I had a discussion at a conference. So I'm dyslexic, and I was undiagnosed dyslexic up until I was in my 30s or a little bit later, and then end up going back to school and all those things. So I want to learn a little bit about your journey and what you learned about yourself. And then later on, we can talk a little bit about how business leaders and HR professionals can support their employees.
Well, just for some perspective, I'm going to be 52 this year. So I am smack in the middle of being a Gen Xer. So autism.
Are you sure you're 52?
I promise everybody they can check my birth certificate. I am 72. I'm sorry, I was born in 72. I'm going to be 52. And so autism, ADHD, those were not things when I was, let's say, primary school, high school. That was not even something that was talked about, thought about. Learning disabilities were, sort of coming into the forefront, but at that age and time, parents really did not want their children to be labeled as having any sort of learning challenges, especially in the school system. And, myself being African American, my parents definitely did not want any sort of label on me. I was also an extremely bright child. I did really well with languages and social sciences. It was, and like things like history, it was things like math and hard sciences, I'll call them, say like your biology, chemistry. That's where I usually struggled. So I was not diagnosed with anything until mid-40s. I was diagnosed with ADHD and very recently officially diagnosed as autistic. So it's been a journey. So everything I learned, I basically learned the hard way, figuring out about myself and how to best show up in corporate America. These weren't things that right now someone could tell you, hey, these are the things that would be good for you if you have ADHD or you're autistic. But that's not something anybody was able to tell me as I was, starting work and, as far as corporate America around 14.
So let's break this down for the viewers,
Yes.
because when I first met you, there are, I'm sure, a lot of stereotypes that you do not fit into the box of, but maybe you're living. So let's kind of break those down for the viewers so that they can just kind of like get an understanding of your lived experience before you go into the details of it. So number one, you grew up in a is it middle class African?
Yeah, middle class, predominantly white town and school. I went to a private elite school in the Massachusetts area. That's where I'm originally from. and
Right.
went to private colleges.
Right. So if we thought about it from the zip code story or the class kind of journey, you may not have that stereotypical kind of African American kind of, um, upbringing, quintessential upbringing.
Yes, the zip code challenge wasn't necessarily there. I was in the zip code.
Are you in the right?
I was in the zip code. I was there.
And you grew up with a two-parent household,
Two-parent household.
had their degrees.
Yep, had their degrees.
Yeah, and this is important for people to really start to understand how the layers of our personalities, of our how we accomplish things, right? So that's why I'm like highlighting this part of it. And so and then also the layer of, although you grew up middle class and your parents still didn't want there to be a label on you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, because if you think about it, my sort of childhood was, 70s and, 80s. And so nobody wanted their child to be labeled, but especially Black parents, because that label would have put me in classes that wouldn't have accelerated me, wouldn't have allowed me to take those advanced classes and things like that. And it probably wouldn't have allowed me to go to private school.
Right. And also I think the intersection part that I want to highlight is that although you grew up middle class, but also being a child of color.
Yes.
Could have put you easily into another category, although you had, grew up with resources, two-parent household, education, all those different things. All of a sudden, if you are, diagnosed as being autistic or ADHD or whatever it is, then you go down a different track.
You go down a different track. And remember, at this point, autism and ADHD are accurate, but also polite ways of saying things. They did not use those terms. I mean, retarded and other such things were words that were used and phrases that were used heavily when, 70s and 80s. The short yellow bus, I mean, the kids took a completely different bus. It was much more stereotyped and could define your life going forward back then, right? It's very different now than it was then.
And I think it's sad that something that can help you could also harm you, because
Exactly.
I was not diagnosed with dyslexia until as an adult, but I remember I was in, for the most part, normal classes, but I was struggling. Had I been in those other classes where I got an opportunity to develop and grow, I might have got an opportunity to develop and grow, but there was all this backlash of what we call joning, right? Or making fun. Kids are horrible, especially in like middle school. So
Yes,
it becomes creative, right?
But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, it also harms you, because let's say that autism, ADHD had been something that was known when I was a child. The harm would have been the labels, the stereotypes, but the benefit would have been maybe learning more about how my brain worked, the best ways to study for me, the best ways to show up at work. There were things that I didn't get to learn on the positive, that things I can share with my daughter now, because she got diagnosed. My daughter is 23, but she got diagnosed at around probably 9 or 10 years old. So she has had a completely different experience just with ADHD and being diagnosed early, like learning plans and, there are tutors like tutors and coaches and doctors that specialize in those. So it is, and they don't put you on a different bus. So it's like, it's completely different now,
Not to mention, there's more of a focus on anti-bullying and programs.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
You and I are very similar age, and we had what I would call, not to take away what kids call bullying now, like we had real bullies would take your lunch money, right? And
Oh yeah, you would. It was violent. Like you would. It was a different experience.
Right. So you did not want to be labeled.
No, you did not want that label.
Cool,
no, absolutely
right?
not.
Which is a whole nother challenge. But anyway, so let's move on. So tell us a little bit about kind of your journey to finding out, and let's also first unpack a neurodivergent, which is, just to make it very simplistic for our viewers, is a person who processes information differently. So that
brain is different. Yeah. So that would fall, I mean, autism, ADHD, but also depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, borderline. There are a lot of things that fall under neurodivergence. a lot of times in the workplace, the people who show up with neurodivergence could have any of those conditions, you can say. And oftentimes they overlap. People often have multiple diagnoses, like particularly if you have, let's say, autism or ADHD, you've probably had some experiences that lead to some anxiety or some depression. The same thing with any of the other conditions that fall under neurodivergence. But at the end, your brain works differently. You process information differently. And I can speak more on my own experiences or those with in my family or my clients that are either have ADHD or autism. And obviously there's some anxiety and depression that often falls in that category.
I'm curious to know, and would have been good to do research on this, but more specifically, how many people are neurodivergent who are not disclosing, right? Because if you go to the employer, now they have a box you can check if you have a disability, and then it'll ask you like a second question. But when I was coming along, I just not too long ago, I told someone I was dyslexic, and they were like, "Oh," like I had something like, "Oh my God."
Yes, it definitely
It was something, right? And so because there's a misunderstanding of it, I'm wondering in our workforces right now and HR professionals, some of the challenges they may be, trying or strategy they're dealing with, maybe not be inclusive of neurodivergent employees.
Well, there's a couple things. There's disclosing on, say, your initial application, right? That's one thing. But then there's also if you should ask for accommodations, right? There's a whole process if somebody needs accommodations or wants accommodations, maybe has an official letter from a doctor that, says these things. I have to be honest, I have never openly disclosed on an application. I've mentioned it in passing once I've had the position, and I have never asked for accommodations. But I will say that every job that I've had, one of the reasons I chose the job was because it would allow me to work the way I needed to. And so I didn't have to ask for something because it was part of my sort of employment package. And a lot of people that are neurodivergent that are in the workforce, because there are a lot who aren't, but those that are in, a lot of them tend to be solo practitioners, entrepreneurs, so that they can set the way that they want to work.
Yes. That we won't go off on that, but that's a whole nother thing. So tell us a little bit about your journey into when you actually were diagnosed officially, because I think you said you always knew you'd had it. So what did that look like for you? And then tell us a little bit about your clients, and then what can HR and business leaders do to support neurodivergent employees?
Well, I'll say that the actual diagnosis, as I mentioned, for ADHD didn't come till my 40s. But when I was in college, I had some academic struggles with, say, my statistics class, my physics class, the subjects that I was struggling in. And I ended up, so we're talking like 90s now, I ended up getting tested, and they said, "Oh, you have some learning challenges." I went to Wellesley College, and the accommodations I got were pretty easy. There's some of the same things that kids get now in high school, like extra time for tests, certain ways to learn to take notes. But by that time, I was a sophomore or junior in college. I was well along the path, and it was those specific classes that I needed extra help in. Like I didn't need extra time on my English exams or to write my papers. I was the type of person who could write a 30-page research paper in one night and get an A at an Ivy League school. So you can see there wasn't a lot of like, she needs assistance. So, all right, I finish, I graduate, I move on. And to be honest, although I had some struggles in the workplace, like I quickly realized I did not like working in I don't want to call it a cube. What do you call it when you're not,
The cube, or
yeah, I guess
cubicle?
like,
A cubicle?
yeah, cubicle. Yeah, I didn't like working in cubicles. I preferred it when I had an office. Even if I was sharing an office, I eventually started working from home. I realized working from home made my life so much easier. And I was doing this like in 2005. Like,
Because
not
of the
only do I,
distraction.
right, it was the distractions of other people. It was the interruptions. It was the lights, it was the sounds, it was the smell, because one of the hallmarks of ADHD and autism is sensory overload. And I found myself getting overloaded at work in such a way that it made it I could do the work, but it was very draining to me, right? So once I was able to work from home, I no longer had that constant drain of sensory overload because I could control my environment, right? Which was one of the main reasons I wanted to work from home. And it wasn't until, unfortunately, I lost my husband in a car accident unexpectedly in 2009. And that led to me seeking help as well as getting help for my daughter, who was 8. And one of the first things they noticed was, hey, I think she might have some challenges with ADHD because she was also struggling in schools, right? So I was taking her to therapy, taking her to tutors. And once they identified the ADHD, they did a full psychological evaluation on her. They said, hey, she's got ADHD. And they said, hey, mom, we think you need some help too. Turned out I had ADHD, which, apple doesn't fall from the tree. So that led to sort of going through getting learning plans for her. And also she was in the 5th grade by the time that happened. She went from failing all of her classes to honor roll. Wow. Just by getting the proper counseling and medication. And honestly, once I started getting it, I was no longer struggling as a suddenly single mom and having to take on all those challenges. But you have to fast forward another 10 years to the pandemic, to the autism diagnosis, because my daughter got TikTok, started getting content about ADHD, which led her to content about autism. She sent it to me thinking about herself. And I was like, forget you. This sounds like my entire life experience. So first it was social media content. Then it was blogs. Then I read probably 6 or 7 different books on autism before I went and got the diagnosis. And the reason I dug so deep, besides the fact that that's my nature to dig deep, it's also a hallmark of autism and ADHD, just hyper focus. The other reason I dug so deep is getting an evaluation is not covered by insurance. It's usually about $2,000. So I wanted to make sure before I took that plunge to get officially diagnosed that I was, pretty certain that that was the case, because, to spend that type of money and find out that's not the case, although it would have given me an answer, I already, it was kind of like, I'm not sure if I want to spend that kind of money just to find out that something isn't true.
And I think that component, the financial component, is important to highlight, because now we're talking about the socioeconomic barriers that are in place to mental health awareness. And not to mention, all the other things we just talked about disclosing or not disclosing, and age and economics and upbringing, all those different things. So, okay, so you start to learn about yourself more, and you understood a lot about how these, how this was impacting your work life, but you were also having to put together a lot of workarounds or strategies.
So every workaround that I developed in the course of my sort of academic and corporate career were pretty much all the recommendations someone would tell you now about working with autism or ADHD. And I'm considered ADHD because of both. But one of the first things is either, working remotely, right? Which is more of a possibility for most people now than it was, 10, 15 years ago. But before that, or if that's not a possibility, is having an office, right? And even though sometimes I shared an office with 1 or 2 other people, it still was removed from, say, the general floor when you're in cubicles and you're surrounded like lots of people and having people walking in front of you and behind you, In an office, I could turn off the overhead light and, have a light on my desk, things like that. People are just, it's harder to interrupt someone when they're in office. Like, you have to open the door, you have to knock, or even if the door is open, people still tend to knock, knock, so those types of things. I tend to ebb and flow in my bursts. I tend to do like a lot of work for a long period of time, and then boom, maybe I do more administrative or less pressing tasks, and I tend to go like this. And a lot of people with neurodivergence work like that. That is a little tricky in a corporate environment. But I also found that
working everyone, the next day you're like taking a nap.
Exactly. And one of the things I realized is the type of work you do matters. If you're answering phones all day, like when I worked at call centers in college, I can't say, well, today's my high day, tomorrow's my low day, right? But when you're working a more independent way of working, you're doing research, you're doing papers, or when I was in talent acquisition, the work, I could change my ebb and flow, right? This is a heavy day. I'm going to take a lot of calls. I'm going to reach out to a lot of people. This is a lower day. I'm going to do a lot of spreadsheets and sending out emails, right? I had more autonomy. And that is something that I really loved about the work I did, because having autonomy let me set the pace, right? And a lot of people struggle, especially with ADHD and autism, when they can't set the pace of their work.
Interesting, interesting. So that leads to my question about, what do HR professionals and leaders and managers within companies and organizations and even in government agencies, what are some things that they can do? Are there signs that maybe people who are not disclosing, or are there things to create a psychological safe environment where people feel comfortable asking for accommodations? Or what are some things that some HR, business leaders and HR professionals and managers can do?
What's interesting is, one, not everybody knows that they have ADHD or autism. They might suspect. So it's hard to disclose something that you don't already know about yourself, right? And the second thing is, it can be a little confusing, because when you start listing symptoms of ADHD or autism or any of the other neurodivergence, I'm sure just about any, we'll call it neurotypical person, would say, oh, that sounds like me too. The difference is like things like sensory overload with lights. A lot of people don't like fluorescent lights, right? Or offices, especially in the summer, tend to be really cold, right? Because they turn the air conditioning up. The difference is it draining you? Is it preventing you from getting your work done? And someone with neurodivergence may not easily admit that that is what's happening. They might start taking a lot of days off, or missing time, or coming in late, leaving early. But those also, if someone's right, they're underperforming, but someone could be underperforming for so many other reasons, right? They might have a sick child at home. They might have something going on with a family member. Like you never really know. But what I would say is, if somebody discloses, then asking what type of accommodations they feel would make them be successful. And sometimes it's as simple as, hey, it's hard for me to do back-to-back meetings. I can't do a 1 o'clock, a 2 o'clock, and a 3 o'clock all an hour long. I need 5 minutes, between meetings, or 10 minutes. And the reason they might ask for that accommodation is putting it in writing, so that when they get pushback on it, right, whether officially or unofficially, be like, hey, I just need 10 minutes, right? Can we start the next meeting at 2:10 instead of, 2 o'clock? I would definitely wait. Or the thing is, a lot of the accommodations that help people with neurodivergence help everybody. Who doesn't want 10 minutes to have a bio break or get something to eat between minutes? Who loves fluorescent lighting or the cold, air conditioned spaces, right? There's a lot of things that benefit.
In the office.
Right. Yeah, in the office. Right. Yeah. So there, a lot of accommodations that people need are simple accommodations that everybody in the workplace would probably enjoy as well, right? That don't have to be specific. It's like, okay, we're giving you this because you have ADHD, right? That's one of the things I would caution. Yeah.
In a meeting, in a staff meeting, like,
Right.
okay, Tracie is going to get an office and here's why. And don't say anything, like having to kind of bring attention to something in a way that's not inclusive, although maybe not a sense of belonging, but it creates.
Right, not making the person stand out. And different people need different types of accommodations. Sometimes it's a later starting time, or an earlier starting time, right? And think about it. When you're in an office environment, usually middle managers or senior leaders, these are the combinations that the rest of us have to make around what goes for them, right? Yeah. We start a meeting when they say they start a meeting, right? Who gets in office is who they say. So a lot of these things aren't really that special. We've just somehow given, we'll call them human accommodations, to the senior leadership without letting it trickle down.
So that, I literally was thinking the same thing it's about power, right, within an organization. So the more power you have, you can actually start a meeting around when it's comfortable for you, and everyone acquiesce to that kind of, that experience, that time frame, or whatever it is. And so what we're really talking about here is equity, right?
Yes.
Shared power, shared resources, and that might be ability to make a decision or the resources that you need for accommodation. So interesting. Okay, so now as we close, if someone's viewing this and they're thinking to themselves, oh, I might be, neurodivergent and I never thought about it. What are some resources or things that they can do, or what are some things that just generally speaking, what are some resources that people can find or that you would recommend that would help them in their journey in understanding this?
I would recommend, for probably one of the easiest resources that doesn't cost any money, is a blog by Samantha Kraft. She is a late diagnosed autistic woman, and I have provided you with the link to her blog, but she's also written books, but her blog is free and a lot of people use it as a resource. It lists not only sort of the different symptoms, but also the challenges that people of color and women face in getting diagnosed. Because one of the things we haven't touched on is people's typical definition of autism does not look like me, right? Does not sound like me, does not look like me. And so there are a lot of women and people of color who who are senior leaders or have done well academically and in the corporate world who don't even know that they have autism, right? Or ADHD. They're struggling in ways that they just put off as their own human deficit. So I think Samantha Kraft's blog is a really great place to start. The next would be Devon Price. She wrote the book Unmasking Autism. That's a very popular book. She is a late diagnosed non-binary autistic person, as well as Jenna, let me get the name right, Nerenberg. She wrote Divergent Minds. That is also another popular book. And then I also sent you the links to 2 tests that are used to diagnose autism. It's typically when an autism diagnosis is done, there are 2 online tests that most practitioners use. And you can do them free online. That will also tell someone like, hey, maybe I might be autistic. I might.
Or to spend $2,000.
Right, before they spend $2,000 to get an official diagnosis. But these are, and I gave you 2 of the most popular ones. There are other ones that hint at neurodivergence and some that are specifically for autism, ADHD. So I just gave you the links to 2 of the more popular ones.
And we will put that in the bio when we post the podcast. But you said something when I first met you, or one of our calls. You said, I am not the stereotypical, I don't look like the stereotypical person who will be diagnosed with autism. Could you talk or speak to that and why? Just so our viewers kind of have an understanding of it.
So I think when most people think autism, they think white, male, maybe nonverbal, like in, say, Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, or extremely verbal, extremely intelligent, Legos trains like a Sheldon in Big Bang Theory. And when autism first started appearing in the DSM, that's sort of the psychiatric manual with all the quote unquote disorders, it was like the late 80s. And then it got refined a couple times. So a lot of the people that were diagnosed, say, in the late 80s, early 90s, 2000s were white, male. And that's where you get that whole Legos or train or kind of nerdy. But women present completely differently. For instance, like when you think the hyperfocus of a young white male with autism, you think trains or Legos. Well, women hyperfocus on other things. I hyperfocused on hair, nails, makeup. Well, that's just a typical girl.
Right.
Autistic girls tend to be extremely verbal and speak early. Oh, well, that's just a girl. She's just talking, right? Autistic women, ADHD, tend to, because women are socialized differently, when we see our deficits in any sort of social interaction, we learn to make eye contact. We read a lot of psychology, sociology books. That tends to be people hyper-focused, which was mine. I was a sociology major, right? And I almost double majored in psychology, but I chose Africana studies instead. But I took a lot of psychology classes. I'm not alone in that. A lot of women do a lot of self-development, psychological reading. So you learn the sort of, you are an over communicator in a lot of ways. You know how to present, and you also tend to do really well in an academic setting. So women are often overlooked. And the same thing happens for people of color, by the way. So what autism looks like and when people are looking and what they're looking for was not me, right? And it's not a lot of women or people of color.
Wow. And so I think this is going to be one of our most popular podcast segments because it's just a fascinating topic. It's interesting. It's people are probably like thinking for themselves. So if someone wanted to reach you, Tracie Taylor, founder of Forge to Thrive, where can they reach you?
They can just go to forge2thrive.com, and that is literally the words forge2thrive.com. And I'm sure you'll put the link in the caption as well.
Absolutely. Tracie, thank you so much for taking the time today to have this very important conversation. And I look forward to our next conversation.
All right. Thank you so much.